Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Baker Institute. It's fantastic to have such a big crowd here in the middle of the day. So today, we are going to have an event on one of our favorite parts of the world, on the Gulf, the Persian Gulf region. And our event today is titled, How Kuwait and some of the other oil giants are navigating the energy transition. And I'll hand it off to Ambassador David Satterfield to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Jim, and thank you all for coming. And for our honored guests from Kuwait, marhaban bik fil Mahad Baker. Welcome to the Baker Institute. We are delighted to be able to host this conversation. We had a discussion that preceded the broader meeting taking place now, in which some very interesting trend lines, projections, options for progress for the Gulf, for the energy sector, were presented. Those projections indicate the very significant decision points which confront the world, not just the Gulf, although that's the focused part of this discussion. But I think in fairness, you could take the different factors that affect decisions, whether in Kuwait, in the GCC countries as a whole, the Gulf, and take them back to the United States, to Europe, to individual developed countries in Europe, elsewhere around the world. You would find the same set of decisions, the same kind of market, technology, investment challenges facing all of us. So this is more than a restricted, limited, or esoteric regional discussion. It has absolute relevancy for the entire world. And I think at this moment, with preparations for another Conference of Parties, COP meeting just spinning up and much press discussion of where that will go, it's important to take a look at the hard facts as well as the decisions needed to translate those hard facts, technology, markets and investment, infrastructure, into the kind of practical, pragmatic decisions which come with costs, as non-decision comes with cost, to shape a future in which a rational, sustainable approach to the provision of energy globally makes sense, can be adopted, and can be adopted on a collaborative, cooperative basis. It can't be done by any one country or small collective of countries alone. It has to be a global approach to make a global approach succeed. It has to be something which can be credibly explained to populations, to market makers, to those stakeholders in industry, in government, and parastatals as the right way to go. The right way to go now for the short and medium term, and the right way to go for the long term. I think based on what we heard in the discussions we had earlier, and I'm sure you will have coming up, you will take away a valuable set of informative points. You'll be able to ask questions, which I think will elicit interesting commentary from the group. We certainly did. But again, thank you all for coming to the Baker Institute. In particular, thank you all to making the trip here. All best.
All right, so I'd like to just set the scene a little bit and invite our speakers to come join me up on the podium or at the dais here. I think we all understand that climate action and climate change is going to be difficult, right? It's just, you often hear it as the mother of all collective action problems that the world faces. But I don't think there's a part of the world that really is going to find it as tough as the Gulf region. I think it's going to be a really difficult problem for them. And sometimes it's described as, kind of a lose-lose a situation for them, sort of on the economic side, right? They've got these economies that are based on oil revenues, and it's also the underpinning of their political systems. So they basically use those oil revenues through in their political system. And on the physical side, climate change is just as worrying. You've had some crazy high temperatures in that part of the world, right? So 54 degrees Celsius or 129.2 Fahrenheit on the thermometer, a couple of years back. So some very, very high temperatures. So it's they need climate action to succeed for the physical survivability of their part of the world. But the success of climate change, if it's of climate action, if it's carried out in a certain way, could also be devastating for their economy. So it's a big dilemma in that part of the region, and that's kind of our topic for today. The Gulf countries aren't just big energy suppliers to the world. That's the way we generally think of them. But they are also big consumers of energy in that part of the world. It takes a lot of energy to live in such a hot climate. And they have carbon footprints that are large, right? So on a per capita basis, larger than ours. So decarbonizing those countries is not going to be a simple matter. However, lots of those countries are now issuing net zero goals. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, the UAE have net zero goals. And they also happen to have some pretty big advantages in decarbonization that you don't often hear about. And so they've got lots of sun, obviously, lots of vacant land near their cities that can be used for renewables and for manufacturing hydrogen. Their emissions tend to be in clusters, and they have great expertise in capturing emissions and sort of geological expertise, a knowledge of the geology underneath them, which happens to be perfect for storing carbon. And they have, at least in some of these countries, some fairly streamlined policy-making, autocratic governance that's where long-term planning isn't a luxury. They can plan for the long term. So they do have some advantages. So with that, I would like to introduce our speakers. Please come up as I introduce you, and we'll turn to them for their remarks. So our featured speaker today is Mr. Badr Al-Attar. So he is the Managing Director for Planning and Finance and the Chief Strategist of the Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. He's got 30 years of experience in the hydrocarbon E&P business and 25 years of experience in strategic planning and portfolio management. He started his career as a reservoir engineer in the Kuwait Oil Company and worked his way up through strategic planning and through the commercial directorate and all the way up into the finance directorate. So if you'd please come up, Mr. Badr Al-Attar. Secondly, we have also from Kuwait, one of our visiting fellows, Dr. Osama Al-Sayegh. Dr. Al-Sayegh is a visiting research scholar here at the Baker Institute. He divides his time between the Center for Energy Studies, where I work, and the Center for the Middle East. He also happens to be a research scientist at the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. He's the director of the Energy and Building Research Center and the director of the Environment and Life Sciences Research Center at the Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research. And he's a technical coordinator in the Kuwait National Nuclear Energy Committee. Let's see. We also have our faculty member, anthropologist, Professor Göçke Günel. She's an associate professor in anthropology at Rice, and she's a faculty scholar here at the Baker Institute. Her latest book, Spaceship in the Desert, Energy, Climate Change, and Urban Design in Abu Dhabi, is recently out. She focuses on the construction of renewable energy and clean technology infrastructures in the United Arab Emirates, and more specifically, the Masdar initiative that you all have probably heard a bit about. And last but not least, my colleague, Dr. Christian Coates-Ulrichsen. Hopefully you know him. He is a fellow from the Middle East. His research examines the changing position of the Persian Gulf states in the global order, as well as the emergence of longer-term non-military challenges to regional security. He's had various positions in other organizations, including the London School of Economics, and he is a prolific author. And let's welcome Dr. Ulrichsen as well. So we'd like to kick it off with some introductory remarks. I want to turn to Badr al-Attar first, and then we'll turn to Dr. Al-Saig, Dr. Gunal, and Dr. Ulrichsen in that order, please. So, Mr. Badr al-Attar, if you want to come and use the podium, you may, or you can stay there. Yeah, and all of you, we should have some comment cards, and if you'd like to write down questions, if something comes to mind, we'll pick those up and I'll sort through them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Floor is yours.
Thanks for the introduction. First of all, I'd like to say I'm very privileged to be here in Baker Institute, to have been invited to talk about this subject of energy transition, and I'm here to represent Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, not necessarily the whole of the Kuwait state, but that part of Kuwait state which is big in terms of this agenda. Quite lucky to have the session in the morning. It gave me a little practice for this session, so which is good. A few points to be made about energy transition, how we relate to it. And I'd like to make sure that these points are related to you here in this audience. First of all, KPC has done several strategies in the past, and these strategies extended from the first one back in '94 to the one in 2000, and then the year 2008, and then 2017, and then an update of that strategy from 2017 in the year 2019, I think. And all of those strategies were speaking about growth in the oil and gas business, of course. And Kuwait, as you know, is heavily dependent on the revenues from the oil and gas. Nevertheless, ever since the agenda of energy transition took place in the world, we took that as a commitment from Kuwait, as well as KPC as part of Kuwait, towards that agenda and our commitment to the world in terms of putting footprint on energy transition in the world. And what that means is, of course, Kuwait is committed and has been committed ever since the Paris Agreement, as well as the recent COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Several targets were mentioned there, be it in 2012, the target of reaching production of renewable about 15%. By the year of 2030, or the recent net zero for the oil and gas to be achieved by the year 2050. Both of those are big to us, of course. To the same extent, they are big to the whole world, wherever the numbers are, wherever the years are. But as a whole, we see ourselves as a national oil company, as I said, is dependent, the state is heavily dependent on the oil and gas. We see that the demand on oil and gas is still going to be there in the future. And with that, we see our commitment as part of this energy transition is to make sure that our barrel is even more efficient in terms of using energy to be produced, as well as for it to be the least emitting of pollution to the air. Nevertheless, this has been done to a great extent so far. So as an example, in 2005, emissions by flaring of the upstream business in Kuwait was in the range of 17%, and nowadays it is less than 0.5%. And we're continuing to have projects to reduce that to the technically acceptable range, even more so. There are, of course, examples of where KPC has used renewable energy, examples of which is the Sidra, what we call is a Sidra 500 project in our upstream. This is the first of its kind in the world to use renewable solar source for the electric submersible pumps put into the wells, and which is going to save us about 500,000 barrels of oil over the next 20 years. Another example is use of solar power in a project to abate scope 2 greenhouse gases emissions for our retail fuel stations inside and outside Kuwait. Also, there are lots of installations of solar energy in our refineries. So these are good examples. Also, there's the recycle of plastics, which saves about 25% of the chemicals used for feedstock in our petchem. In the future, we see ourselves so far putting millions of dollars of projects worth. However, in the future, so far we've been putting millions of dollars in terms of achieving this. However, in going to the future, towards year 2040 and to year 2050, we see that we need to scale up our investments in the billions of dollars. To year 2040, we believe we are going to be in the range of $20 billion, and between 2040 and 2050, we believe we need to extend that to an additional $90 billion investment. This includes in whole a lot of increase in electric vehicle penetration in the European markets, going to reach 18,000 charging points in outside Kuwait. Also, in terms of recycled plastics, we want to build the infrastructure for collection and sorting of the plastic wastes that to be used for petchem, which is going to be in the range of a capacity of 120,000 tons per annum. There's also a project on biofuels in terms of to meet the global market for focus of second generation biofuels inside and outside state of Kuwait. This is to reach about 13 million tons per annum by the year 2050. There is also intention for green hydrogen, where we enter green hydrogen business, assuming there will be low cost for solar PV and storage, and to reach about 1 million tons by the year 2050. Altogether, we see that these initiatives will cost about $65 billion by the year 2050. The point on national oil company going towards energy transition, we see that the trend is going to be slow at the beginning to the year 2040 and then sharply increase after 2040. This should allow us to use the technology that is in hand today, as well as wait for more technology that can take us into the higher targets that we see ourselves facing in this respect. Maybe another point to mention is the fact that there are challenges that we are going to face, and there are success factors that we are needing to focus on. including availability of the funds. As you see, the scale is moving from millions of dollars to billions of dollars, and availability of land for the solar panels, and eventually also the technology required by leveraging our relations with the partners. And altogether, I see that we also need to be, as a world, and I refer to His Excellency's opening remarks, we see that there needs to be a lot of collaboration in the world for this to happen. We see no other ways of doing this except for the world to come together and help each other to achieve this. It is a responsibility to be shared. We are responsible to produce our hydrocarbon in the best ways that are sustainable for the world, exactly the same way we do it for Kuwait. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Badr. So I'd like to turn to our three fellows here and get some brief remarks from them. We'll start with Dr. Al-Sayegh, and then to Dr. Gunal, and then Dr. Ulrichsen, please.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you very much. I'm going to do actually just pick up on what just Badr ended it, is the issue of energy transition. Energy transition should be looked at a relative point of view. What I mean by that, there are issues that need to be taken into consideration without getting the world into more tension of implication of energy transition. So far, the picture that's been given for energy transition, we understand the challenge of carbon emission, increasing temperature of the world. Of course, that's an issue that we all care about, but at the same time, you don't want to create more chaos to the world that is involved to its economy, stability, political tensions between the world when it comes to this transition. So that's why it is important that for the world to collaborate toward this agenda by moving gradually to the sustainable, clean energy sources while taking into consideration the stability and of the world. Because you don't want to face an issue with the tension and stability of the world. And again, the energy transition is a package. It's not just moving from fossil fuel to clean. No, it's again a package that's involved a transition not only in technology, not only in material, but also what is most important, a transition of behavior, transition of collective mind of how we consume and we live our life. That's need to be, of course, that's what I would say gradually. That's where the education comes. That's why it would take maybe probably generations until we reach this way. I know we face a challenge there, but however, you don't want to do it sharp to avoid any instability as we've seen so far for example, putting pressure on the world market. I'm just going to stop here and move on. Thank you, Jim.
Good.
Oh, thank you so much for these insightful comments. Actually, I'm going to ask some more questions maybe to Mr. Al-Attar, and by bringing in some of my own experience of doing research in the UAE. So I guess my first question was sort of whether we could contextualize Kuwait's energy transition in the Gulf and more globally. And I'm curious to hear what the more unique challenges are that face Kuwait. And one of the reasons I'm asking this is because, for instance, when I was doing research in the UAE and now even when I do research there, I always hear the idea that sort of we should think about climate change as a business opportunity, that we should see this as a sort of as a way to sort of diversify our economies and add new sectors of growth and add new sort of kinds of expertise to our economy. And so there's almost an optimism sort of associated with climate change. that perhaps negates some of the kinds of fears around, what the world will look like with climate change. And then my second question is about sort of maybe more closely related to your expertise, is about sort of the differences between national oil companies and international oil companies in thinking about the energy transition. Again, sort of thinking back to sort of my own experiences of doing research in the UAE, one of the things that I observed there was, for instance, when building carbon capture and storage related policy, the national oil company, ADNOC, had a very different kind of perspective on what needed to be done than than Shell, BP, etc., other companies that were involved in making those decisions. And I saw tensions emerge between the priorities of those companies. And I wonder if Kuwait faces these kinds of challenges, and if there are sort of different actors with different perspectives as you're sort of going forward with the energy transition project. And then I guess this is sort of ties back a little bit to Dr. Al-Sayeg's last comment about the how energy transition is a package. So I'm also kind of curious, because I've done research on the construction of Masdar City, I'm also always drawn to ideas around how transformation in energy infrastructure might impact other forms of infrastructure. So what would be, I wonder if there's an imagination around the kinds of spaces that will emerge as a result of an energy transition in Kuwait. Would there be different kinds of urban projects or different kinds of infrastructure projects that follow this, that maybe imagine a different kind of life for Kuwait's population? So maybe I'll end there, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much.
Some tough questions there. All right. Christian.
Thank you, and thank you for the opening comments. I'd just like to say a few words of my own about some of the political aspects, the political dimensions, because we've heard a lot about infrastructure and the technocratic and energy-related issues. But of course, everything will have to take place within a political framework. And if you fly over the Gulf at 30,000 feet, the region can look quite similar. But of course, the 6 Gulf monarchies that form the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, are all in fact quite different, politically, economically, and in terms of their resource endowment. So there's no one-size-fits-all linear approach, I would imagine. And we've seen that, I think, reflected in some of the initial targets and outlines for net zero strategies and other approaches. So, for example, in Kuwait, we have a political dynamic, a parliamentary system which can be extremely populist at times, which we simply don't have in some of the other Gulf states, in which decision-making is much more perhaps authoritarian, centralized, without any significant pushback from elected political figures. Questions of political will be important not only in Kuwait, but in the other Gulf states in different ways. Sometimes actually vested interests are easier if they're above the surface. It can be the vested interests that are below the surface that can be much more intangible and difficult to take on, perhaps in other Gulf countries other than Kuwait. We have Qatar, United Arab Emirates, that Gökçe has just talked about, which are blessed in many ways with enormous reserves of gas in Qatar, oil in the UAE, especially mostly in Abu Dhabi, and small citizen populations that Jim was talking about. So the resource to demand ratio is very favorable to the regimes in those states. Whereas, of course, in Bahrain and in Oman, we have the opposite. We have pockets of relative energy poverty. We have larger citizen populations, at least in Oman, and perhaps different sorts of pressures that the authorities are going to have to face. And then, of course, there's Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest state in the Gulf, both by territory and by population. Saudi Arabia is 7 times bigger than the next biggest Gulf country, GCC, without Yemen. And that's Oman, and Oman itself is bigger than the other 4 Gulf states put together. So Saudi Arabia is, in many ways, the literal elephant in the room. It also has a population of 35 million people, 26 million of whom are Saudi citizens. So the per capita resource endowment in Saudi Arabia is again very different from Kuwait, from Qatar, from Abu Dhabi, and from the UAE in general. So these are some of the differences which I think are going to be useful to bear in mind when considering the transitions, considering some of the political and economic trade-offs that will have to be made if these transitions are to unfold over a period of decades. And I'd like to end just by, Jim mentioned about the long-term planning, and of course all the Gulf states have Vision 2030. In Saudi Arabia's case, Qatar has a Vision 2030, Bahrain has a Vision 2030, Kuwait has Vision 2035. The UAE, I think, just launched Vision 2071 for the centenary of the UAE's creation as a federal state in 1971. So they have the luxury of thinking long term. But for many of the leaderships who are, like we have here or in other countries around the world, the leaders themselves they won't be here in 2070. They won't have to think about what it means for them if we get this transition wrong. I would just finally point out that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who intends to rule for 40 or 50 years like his grandfather did. His grandfather, Abdulaziz, the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, took Riyadh in 1902 and remained king until 1953. Mohammed bin Salman wants to rule a kingdom that is stable. This will come on his watch. We hear a lot about 2070 being a tipping point, when studies have suggested that the Arabian Peninsula might be dangerously hot for human habitation. Well, in 2070, Mohammed bin Salman will be the same age his father, King Salman, is today. So this will happen on his watch. He needs to get this right, which is why the focus needs to be on, as you say, the balance between transition and sustainable political and economic trajectories. Already, even by the 2040s, we've just finished a cycle of Hajj pilgrimages over the summer. And of course, the time of the year cycles around with the difference in the calendars. But already by the time of the next cycle of summer Hajj in the 2040s, already by then, there are indications that rising temperatures may make it difficult, if not dangerous, to perform the pilgrimage in the summer months. And so these are, and of course for a country like Saudi Arabia, which to some extent rests its legitimacy on religious grounds, again, these are public policy issues they will have to get right if they're to move forward in a sustainable way. So Jim, back to you.
All right. Well, thanks to all of our panelists. Ways to really concentrate minds on some of the dilemmas, right? So some pretty serious stuff, I think, that we have to discuss here. So I want to kick it off with a few questions, but definitely don't want to monopolize the questions. I'm sure that you all have some questions and thoughts, and I hope that so what you've heard so far spurs some. So we've got some folks circulating in the audience, and if you can please, jot down a question briefly, and hopefully type big enough that I can read it. I may not have my glasses with me, so please write in big type. So let me kick off with a couple of questions, and I think I might start with one of yours, Gertschik, if I can ask our speakers to expand on this notion of the energy transition as a threat or opportunity for this part of the world. I mean, I think we can all agree there's probably not going to be a business emerging out of the energy transition that we know about anyway that's as profitable as the oil business is in the Gulf, where you can produce oil for $7.50 by the latest count I saw in Saudi Arabia, and then to sell it across the border for $85 or $90. We're probably not going to see something quite as profitable as that, but is it the oil business isn't going to go to zero either. So one expects that it remains. So how is it viewed in the Gulf? And I might start with you, Mr. Badr.
All right. First of all, I'd like to respond to that, which is probably the same question asked earlier. We view this as our responsibility to the world in terms of not reacting but proacting with the situation. We are, like I said, we are heavily dependent on oil and gas. We believe that oil and gas is still going to be in demand in the future. I mean, yes, the projections say that the percentages will be lower, but actually the quantities will still be higher in terms of oil and gas. So we, as KPC, we are determined and committed to the world in terms of providing this energy. But given the energy transition agenda, we would like to do it in an even more responsible way in terms of emissions and in terms of energy efficiency. And we have targets towards that. I discussed earlier or mentioned earlier the flare percent, which needs to go lower than 1%. We've achieved that in Kuwait side, but in the partition zone, we need to do that. And we have 2 projects in terms of central utilization of gas and the network of the gas there, which is driving to the 1% or lower than 1% flare. In terms of energy efficiency, we would like to drive that up by 1 to 3% compared to what it is today by the year 2040. So in response to, is it a challenge or an opportunity, we see it as a responsibility from us to the world. And in doing that, we also see it as an opportunity to do things better and in more efficient ways. And what should keep us from there is probably the only thing that is how economic it's going to be. And as we've seen with other examples, solar panel is one. Cost came down from considerably high cost to lower, much lower, and it is still going down. We expect that the same thing is going to happen with other technologies, which then makes us even fitter, even more lean in terms of producing an extra oil barrel to the market. While saying that, please note that this is a big responsibility on our shoulder. Ever since before, not just now, and we've achieved part way of that so far. I'd like to achieve more in the future. So to that, I answer as such. Maybe Jim, if you allow me, in terms of answering to the second question, in terms of differences between national and international oil companies. Please. Yes, there is. We see differences, and we see international oil companies being private, more at ease in terms of going to energy transition. They are for energy more so than oil and gas today, whereas KPC is in the energy transition. We say we would like to use the other sources of energy for our oil and gas business to be more efficient. So that's one difference. And mind you, even the international oil companies are differing from each other. So we've heard some of them are going very extreme to the right side, some of them are to the left side, but some of them are even changing and learning from what's happening. An example of point is British Petroleum. So those are differences we see in terms of national and international. I don't know if I missed any of your questions.
No, I think you got the gist of it there. I wonder if I could just turn to Osama briefly on this topic as well, and maybe talk a little bit about this notion of threat or opportunity, but also hurdles to get to net zero. Kuwait has a net zero plan by 2060, right? So, do you think it's a realistic goal, and can a carbon and energy intensive, a hydrocarbons intensive economy like Kuwait's, where it's built into society, into governance, can it realistically get to net zero? If you can get into that a bit.
Yeah, though this pledge has actually was announced in the late COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, where 2050 by the oil sector we're going to achieve the net zero, by the rest of the sectors by 2060. But to answer this question, Jim, just let me give you, for example, I'm just going to take the power sector as an example on answering this. Can the power sector in Kuwait, which is 100% oil and gas driven, cogeneration, meaning our power sector does not only generate electricity but desalinate water. Kuwait's source of water, 90% of potable water from desalination. So all of our power plants right on the shore, and they have to be on the shore. Now, the question now is, I have about 20 gigawatts of capacity. By 2060, we're going to be doubled, around 40 gigawatt. Just let me take one option. Let's take the option of 100% renewable energy, which is, I know this is hypothetical, is impossible. So that's mean I have to deploy all my power system right on the shore. By the way, Kuwait is 18,000 square meter land. It's the size of New Jersey or maybe less. So we need about more than 10% of Kuwaiti territory for the deployment of, say, solar fields in order for us just to desalinate water. So this is ruled out. So even if we go for 50%, that's also an issue for the stability of the grid. Now, how are we going to achieve this? The only option to go and stabilize nuclear option has to be there. Unfortunately, I know Kuwait is not embarking on nuclear officially, but if Kuwait, especially I'm not talking about other sectors, only the power sector. If they're going to achieve the net or near zero, nuclear has to be always on the table. So that's number one. Number two, again, for the transition, and I mean, that's why I mentioned earlier, it has to be as a package. Now, everybody's talking about, let's just increase the dosage of this green, clean energy, but nobody's talking about to control the consumption and the behavior of the consumption. By the way, just to give you a feel, I understand here the electricity tariff here in Houston, somewhere about 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Mm-hmm. In Kuwait, 0.7 cents. We're not even reaching 1 cent. So how I'm gonna invest or encourage people to invest in renewables? Okay, well, my electricity is low. So it's really a fight. You see people really advocating to invest, but at the same time, the majority say why? So that's another thing that it's pull. So it is achievable. That's why we have to do a drastic reforms in our, say, for example, energy subsidy system, especially for the electricity, for example, to come and control the consumption and the behavior in order for us to achieve and realize the goal that we put. Until then, it's still vague, okay? But yes, it's achievable if we'll be able to control the consumption, if we're able to allow other options beside the renewables, because as we see, renewables is intermittent, variable, that causes a problem on the grid. So that's why all option has to be open, including, of course, the hydrogen, the blue hydrogen, and with the, of course, carbon capture technology to be integrated with our infrastructure in order for us to achieve the goal of the power sector. And of course, we're talking about transportation sector, that's another story, but I'm just gonna stop right here.
So, sounds like it's achievable, but disruptive, right? So some major reforms, including in law, in habits, behavior, incentive structures, et cetera. I mean, it's not It's not a small an issue here. Okay, well, and also all options, right? I mean, I think that's not only,
Exactly.
you know, I mean, that's, you know, I think that's a prerequisite. You know, you can't just rule out different options. Can I move to Gökçe? I wanted to ask about an early kind of experiment in decarbonization and the Masdar initiative, which you know so well and have written a book about in Abu Dhabi. Are you all familiar with the Masdar initiative? Who's never heard of it? Okay, all right, great. So maybe could you, Gökçe, please describe it and you know, let everybody know what it is first of all, but then, you know, is there you know, is this a potential model in any way for the region, or, you know, those of us outside the region?
Oh, thank you so much for your question. I mean, to put it simply, Masdar is the state-sponsored renewable energy and clean technology company of the UAE. And it became known in the sort of early 2000s, maybe around 2006, 2007, for an eco-city project that it started called Masdar City. And Masdar City circulated around the world, sort of in the media, quite heavily between the years 2007 and 2011. But its master plan, which promised a sort of a carbon-free sort of urban plan, was canceled in late 2010. And so, and I guess one of the questions that I asked earlier, which is sort of related to sort of whether you know, climate change is a threat or is it an opportunity, is sort of related to my experience with Masdar, because I think from the UAE's perspective, Masdar appeared to be a sort of like a way to diversify the economy and to sort of expand into the renewable energy, clean technology sector, to build a knowledge-based economy rather than a sort of a fossil fuel-based, oil-based economy. And so, and the project is again most well known for the eco-city, which did not necessarily get built in the way that it was promised, but it also had other sort of parts to it, which were, you know, an international diplomacy part, sort of an investment wing, and a sort of a wing that developed power stations, and also something called Masdar Institute, which allowed people from around the world to come and study in Abu Dhabi, and they received graduate degrees at Masdar Institute, and those graduate degrees were also sort of, I guess, supervised by MIT. So that's an overview of what Masdar did. But to go back to the sort of the question around whether that experimental model helps or what can be learned from it, I think in terms of urban planning, perhaps we're less and less seeing projects like Masdar City today. In the early 2000s, eco-cities or smart cities that were built from scratch were seen as good solutions towards future urban issues, specifically related to climate change. And now I think we're seeing more and more of emphasis on smaller, more less visible interventions in urban planning. So building materials, for instance, has become a big issue, and I think we see similar conversations in the Gulf as well, looking at whether what alternative materials could be used to replace the emissions from concrete and steel production, and the use of those products in construction. So maybe as an urban planning method, it's become less of a sort of a less popular in the last 15 years, and then, but I think the fact that the COP is now happening in the UAE is perhaps related to the sort of emergence of Masdar as a company that promoted renewable energy and clean technology, and that still does so, and so in the sense of putting the UAE on the map for climate diplomacy, perhaps it had an effect, and it allowed the IRENA headquarters to be built in the UAE, and again for the COP to happen there. So I think maybe this goes back to sort of the transition as a package, maybe. I think that comment sort of really summarizes the kind of interventions that have been happening in the UAE, because the transition is both a diplomacy project, it's a financial sort of investment project, it's an urban project, it's also a project on sort of, again, knowledge production. So there are many phases to it, I think, and as other panelists summarize, it's not just about sort of putting solar panels on your roofs. Yeah.
Great. All right, and one last question before I'll start to get to the questions that are coming up here, which are excellent so far. I'm going to try to bundle a bunch of them together. But while I'm doing that, I wanted to bring in Dr. Ulrichsen, Christian Ulrichsen here to talk about how you balance so the climate on the physical and the economic threats. This notion that you have these governments in the region that use those oil rents, the oil profits to stay in power, to provide very generous social service benefits to their people, and the sort of the threat that climate action and the just the simple decline in oil demand globally, what that represents, and some of the shorter and longer term effects, planning and otherwise, that might bring up.
Thanks. And just building on what Dr. Gunnell was talking about, Masdar, of course, Masdar was developed by Sultan Al-Jaber, who rose to prominence as a result of that, is now the UAE's climate envoy, is in charge of organizing COP, but is also the head of ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. So he's wearing two, what we might see as quite distinct hats, climate envoy and National Oil Company executive, in addition to his renewable energy credentials. So you see there the climate diplomacy, I suppose, that is developed, where the UAE, and this goes to your question, Jim, the UAE now sees utility in having a seat at the table, and not just ignoring or pretending that the climate conversations are not going to have an impact, because of course, as Jim said, it goes to the political and economic structure of these societies based on the distribution of oil and gas revenues to their citizens. And so the UAE perspective, I think, Saudi Arabia had to some extent a similar perspective in 2020, when the Saudis were the host that year of the G20, and they developed what they call the circular carbon economy, at least a way to try to engage with the negotiations in ways that did perhaps least damage to their interests. And I think we'll see that probably very heavily emphasized in the run-up to, during, and after COP28, which I presume will take place in November in Dubai, taking place in the site of the Dubai Expo, actually, which again is another sort of mega project of the UAE to sort of internationalize and put itself on the map. What's fascinating about Masdar is that the lessons that you were talking about, it's almost as if Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia is trying to apply them to NEOM and to the Line. He has this huge project called the Line, which again, similar to Masdar in its early stages, is being planned as a car-free urban space. Now, we saw with Masdar how in the 2000s the technology perhaps wasn't there at scale and at cost. So the initial plans were downsized and then pushed back in terms of time frame, and then to some extent abandoned. With NEOM, with the Line, we're now two decades on. It'll be very interesting to see whether the technological advances in those 2 decades gives NEOM, gives the Line any chance of a better prospect of success than Masdar. Now, of course, we probably won't be able to do case studies comparatively until 10 or 15 years from now, but I look forward to your next book on that. But yes, getting those trade-offs right will be absolutely critical to the long-term sustainability. And you've said it yourself, Jim, you've written about the needs of short-term political and economic stability often come at the expense of a long-term sustainability argument. Mm-hmm. So you're probably the one best placed here to talk about how you bridge that gap.
Well, I mean, I think it's one of the luxuries of planning in that part of the world that they have. I mean, you have, I mean, Kuwait is the sort of the outlier in this way, that it's much more democratic. It's got a parliament, an elected parliament that the other countries don't really have. So it's a bit more, can I say, a difficult policymaking environment maybe than the other 5 monarchies. But these systems, they have the luxury of long-term planning that's much more difficult to do in the U.S. I mean, we're probably more like Kuwait, where we have this gridlock in policy making, and we're even more probably short-term focused. But it's also, when you have that, when you finally go through that democratic policy making and enact a policy, it tends to be more durable. I think in autocratic systems, it's easier to make a U-turn on policy. So, if it doesn't work out in the way that it's intended. So double-edged sword there. Okay, so I've got a ton of great questions here, and we've got a half an hour. What I'm proposing is, and I hope my panelists are with me here, can we do quick answers to some of these questions? And a lot of them are for you, Mr. Badr, and regarding KPC, or Osama for you regarding Kuwait in general. 3 questions on carbon capture and storage I've gotten already. So I wonder if you could talk about so we heard that renewables and solar isn't going to be able to carry the entire load. What is the role for carbon capture in Kuwait in some of these goals?
So in relation to the earlier point I was making, is how we use some of these agendas to the oil and gas production. Carbon capture is, again, one of those examples. We have oil fields that are now been producing ever since 1934, I guess, and some of them are very mature. So they've matured into not just the primary, but now they are in the secondary, and soon they're going to be in the tertiary. And some of these reservoirs need injection of hydrocarbons so that we can produce more from them. And one of those fields in the West Kuwait is piloting right now the injection of hydrocarbons, and the equivalent of that is the capture of CO2 and the injection of that CO2 into the reservoir. The challenge there is, again, the economics, whereby right now it is in the range of $250 per ton, and we'd like it to be in the range of $70 per ton. So we're working on that. It is a pilot at this stage, but it is going to be a full field later, and it's got its own challenges as well. So that's my response.
What's the source of CO2?
So we've got the downstream facilities, and we find that supposedly good enough to start with, but the capital is huge for capturing that and then transmitting that to the oil field.
So from the oil sector itself?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I've got a question here about LNG. One of you asked whether or not Kuwait imports LNG, and it does. So, but I wanted to see what what the prospects were. How long you expect to be importing LNG, whether or not there's opportunities to push some of that out with solar or with domestic gas supplies in Kuwait. And I'll open that up to anyone here.
All right. So in general, the answer to the question of LNG, are we importing? Yes, we are. And we have long-term agreements for that. The reason why is because our gas production from the fields, in terms of free gas, which is non-associated with the oil, is not enough. So we are growing the non-associated into the future. We are in the range of 0.5 billion standard cubic feet per day, and we want to reach 2 billion by the year 2040. That's just production from the oil fields. However, even that isn't enough for the local demand, in which case we have started importing LNG, and it's going to be long while we depend on that.
Including LNG from the U.S., by the way, right? Once in a while, there's a cargo of shale gas that makes its way into the Gulf, which I remember when that started. I always found that a little bit mind-blowing, actually. Osama, may I turn to you on this question as well? Is there, I see Dubai doing this, using solar as a way to save on fuel costs at conventional power plants. They're also importing LNG in the UAE. They're also a net importer of natural gas. Is that an opportunity that we also see in Kuwait, or is it a different situation?
Well, Kuwait, the main constraint I think in Kuwait, it's the geography. That's really a main concern. That's why it puts the renewable energy projects deployment expansion within a limited capacity. So that's why probably Badr is better than me on this, on addressing the gas issue. But so that's why, being a scholar, that's why we call for Kuwait to expedite the process of developing its fields. I know, Badr, you may maybe want to address on the future exploration of the northern field, Durra field. So other things that to bring the LNG, to bring the gas, local gas production, so to be less, or to be basically satisfy all the need inside rather than just depends on the import. So are we seeing this, Badr?
Yeah. So like I said, it's looking at the forecasts in terms of supply from the oil fields, be it the associated or non-associated gas. That's not enough for local demand, in which case we are dependent on LNG imports. But that reminds me, if I may, to go
Please.
into another field in the North Kuwait where it is heavier crude than the Kuwait export crude specifications. And in there we need to inject, because it's heavy, we need to inject steam. And with steam today, there is an opportunity of using solar for that field, and we're looking at that. So there are these opportunities, again, to the point of using renewable towards oil and gas.
Interesting. So Oman, I think, is doing something similar for some extra heavy crude oil. Okay. We've got a question on nuclear power development in Kuwait, and I know it's something that's been looked into. I might ask Osama to give us the state of affairs in nuclear.
As a matter of fact, first call for nuclear was in the 70s, mid-70s. As a matter of fact, there was a bid was put, envelopes was opened, but due to the 3 Mile Island accident that happened in the US, Pennsylvania, plus the start of the Iraq-Iran war started at that time, so the project was cancelled. Well, during the mid-2000, actually when the oil, again, prices went up and Kuwait has to look into another sources. So 2009, a committee was formed. And as a matter of fact, all the plans were put, even a draft nuclear law was put. We sent students to the States here, more than 40 students as a nuclear engineers. We put the roadmap. We were just rolling very nice, very well. Well, March 2011, Fukushima happened, and unfortunately, the program was cancelled again. But however, the government now and then, they do ask my institute, Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research, being the consultant or the advisor for the government, to ask whether should we go back again to nuclear or not. So this is being under study as the visibility study, but this is not official. But you know, just for the government, for decision makers, policy makers, just to understand and see how, whether they go, especially now with the new technology, the 4th generation of nuclear coming up. So God knows, maybe we'll see something maybe in the long-term future.
Right. Okay.
Inshallah.
Right. I wanted to ask a bit about something we discussed earlier about encouraging trading, a bit more energy and maybe even water trading. I think Christian mentioned how distinct each of these states are on the Arabian Peninsula. But one of the remarkable things about living there, I found, is that there's surprisingly little trade in energy, products and services between, or even water, between these 6 countries. There is an interconnection in the power sector, but it's not used as much as like the interconnections you see here in the U.S. So I wonder if I could turn it over to Göçke and ask about interconnections, and maybe open that up for for the others here to discuss more trade of gas and power and water.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, in a way, I think that question brings us to the demand side of the equation, although we've been discussing more so the supply side of the energy transition project. And in our session in the morning, we discussed how there would be 3 commodities to look at perhaps, or 3 areas of demand. 1, electricity, 2, water, and then 3, air conditioning as commodities that would need to be managed and going forward. Can you hear me?
Closer to the mic.
Closer, okay. And so the electricity project, there is an interconnection. There's a grid that brings all the GCC countries together, but because of the subsidies that GCC countries offer their citizens, it becomes harder to sort of agree on a price that would be set to facilitate electricity trading across these countries. And with water use also, we see the implementation of desalination technologies across the Gulf. Of course, every country is different, and they produce different volumes of desalinated water. And the desalination technologies are also extremely energy intensive, so we see sort of a different kind of transition project happening there, where there's a push to use solar panels to power desalination projects. And then with air conditioning, I guess, I believe about 70% of the electricity produced across the Arabian Peninsula is used for air conditioning. And so this is not a small number. And of course, you can compare it to sort of how much energy heating sort of our homes might take in other colder places and compare it to that. But thinking about the volume of sort of air conditioning is also going to become important as we sort of, I guess, perhaps navigate other kinds of challenges.
Christian.
Yeah, thanks. So just to add about your question about why there hasn't been more trading among the 6 GCC states. And for example, in the nuclear issue, there was a plan in 2007 for a feasibility study at the GCC level for a GCC-wide nuclear energy program. And then the UAE sort of took everyone by surprise and announced their own national program. And this has always been a sort of tension between national level and regional level that is still there. Mm. For gas, for example, for LNG, we talked about Kuwait and Dubai importing LNG, but they don't get it from Qatar. You have the world's largest LNG exporter on their doorstep, but the gas comes from far away, from I think Russia and was it Australia perhaps as well?
They get some gas from Qatar, but
very little amount.
The field is so close that a pipeline would be a more efficient way of transporting
it. As well, you have the pipeline. You have the pipeline from Qatar to Abu Dhabi, Dolphin, which goes on to Oman. But even there you have politics involved in the sense that initially the pipeline was going to go to Kuwait as well. And in the 2000s, it was the Saudis who intervened to stop the pipeline from being built. They tried to stop it from being built from Qatar to Abu Dhabi as well. They didn't succeed in that connection. And I suspect that the Saudis especially did not necessarily want to see the smaller Gulf states becoming more independent of Saudi being able to utilize their reserves separately. So there's always been a question of regional politics as well, which I think people have to bear in mind.
So political fragmentation and you know, the pricing disparities at the borders too, right? So that to make it difficult. Any further comment?
Well, on the issue of water, as actually trade, by the way, just Kuwait has tried actually to strike a deal with Iraq to have water. I'm talking about during the 70s. But they failed due to political issues. The same thing with Iran, by the way. They strike also almost a deal with Iran, but again, due to political issues and tension, these deals never happen. And by the way, even from Turkey, we're supposed to get also water from Turkey, but again, with the rising population and the need of water, scarcity of water, that's all put all these actually plans down. So yeah, it's getting tough. There's more challenges we're seeing in the Gulf, especially with the issue of water, indeed.
Okay. I have another question for Mr. Badr here on hydrogen. It is, I know we spoke a little bit about it earlier, but questions about exports, specifically exports to Europe. There's this the big NEOM project in Saudi Arabia has got a really large green hydrogen export oriented plant that's, I think, is going to be exporting green ammonia to Europe. There's been some talk about it in the UAE. Is that something that KPC is interested in, is investing in, curious about?
Well, hydrogen is part of, the green hydrogen is part of the agenda for in our plans. I wouldn't say exporting.
Not, okay.
Yes, at all. But the use of hydrogen in terms of petchem is there in the plants. Yes.
Domestic use.
Yes.
So as a heat source for the petrochemical plants,
Right.
to decarbonize them,
Exactly.
right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. I have an interesting question here that it talks about, it's a bit about Iraq in juxtaposition with Kuwait. So the question asks, yes, well, Kuwait's a very wealthy country, can afford to keep the air conditioning running, but right next door you have Iraq, a much poorer country that still doesn't have, you know, gosh, I mean, when I lived there, I think the power was on for about 8 hours a day, including in the summer, and you had to have, you know, a diesel generator to keep things reasonable. It's still like that. I think it's improved somewhat. But that, you know, that high temperature that I spoke about, 129.2, you know, a few years back in the summer, wasn't just in Kuwait, it was also in Basra, just across the border, just as hot and more difficult to, you know, to cool yourself down in Basra. I mean, people were jumping into the river, et cetera. So I was wondering, is there a, you know, in your energy transition thinking, is there a way that that poorer countries in the region can somehow, you know, to cope with this? Is the plan different for them? And I don't know, how can you, you know, I'm not sure what the question, you know, asks how we can square the experience of Kuwait with the experience of the country next door. Open that to anyone here.
Actually, recently, Iraq just signed actually an agreement with the Gulf Corporation Council Interconnection Grid recently to export electricity to Iraq. And by the way, Kuwait is a big supporter of Iraq, is continuing developing right in Basra, as a matter of fact, all sectors, education, health. So we understand it is challenging. The weather is harsh and challenging, but hopefully with the new development, with the interconnection grid, that's definitely will help. And by the way, maybe my colleagues Badr can also support in that. There was also an agreement, basically even way before the signing agreement of the interconnection grid, that Kuwait would export electricity to Basra. Way before that, even right after the liberation of Kuwait, it was sometime in 2008, 2009, around this time, is for Kuwait to export electricity to Iraq. But unfortunately, due to the political unrest in Iraq, probably that's why the building or investing in this infrastructure has just basically delayed these issues.
Wow. I mean, the amount of natural gas that's flared in southern Iraq, I mean, you can see it from the Kuwaiti border. It's sort of a strange juxtaposition. You've got Kuwait that's desperately short of natural gas, and here's you know, this amazing amount being wasted right next door, and yet there's insufficient power. So I know this is a long-term process in Iraq to try and capture that gas and turn it into electricity, or even potentially export it at some point. I mean, Iraq's even importing gas from Iran right now, right? So, you know, you can see the problem keeps expanding as we you know, we focus in on Kuwait, but you know, our lens keeps going outward. Would anyone else like to comment on that, or anything that we've spoken about so far?
Maybe I can quickly comment on the Iraq comparison, because I think when we look at a country like Iraq, we see that there's a layering of multiple kinds of challenges. And so some of the problems that you've identified, it's hard to say, is it because of climate change? Is it because of war? Is it, what are the reasons why exactly, say, power cuts happen? So I think, climate change becomes a sort of like an interesting issue to examine, but then when it's juxtaposed with other kinds of challenges, it creates different results. So I think putting Kuwait and Iraq side by side in that sense shows us how other sort of contextual factors affect the ways in which climate change can be mitigated, or climate change adaptation projects can be sort of put forward.
Okay, I've got so two more I want to ask, and then I think we'll call it a day here. Oh, maybe not. Okay, we got one more coming. So here's an interesting question. What do you think about the point of view that, quote, if we build renewables, it helps to increase exports? Mr. Butler, I might start with you on that one.
In general, we agree to the point, because if we can be more efficient in our energy, you know, today we may be burning oil for the sake of electricity. If we are able to use renewable, then that is freed up for export. So yes, we agree to the point.
Okay. Did you want anything?
Yeah, actually,
Osama?
that's why we're saying the transition is about balance. It's not about just, you know, focusing on one side, leaving the other side. Meaning that, okay, sure, I'm gonna increase my dose of renewables, but I also have to make sure that this will not cause any instability in my grid. So it's a combination. They have to go together, looking at the ultimate benefits of the well-being of the country and nation and region, of course.
Okay. All right. Here's another one, again for you, Your Excellency. The KPC goals for energy transition are laudable but distant, 2040, 2060. Are there mileposts to monitor progress after 5-year periods?
Yes, this has come up quite often, and you are right in raising this as a point. To us, everything in KPC, not just energy transition, is also measured and in year by year. And right now, as I may have mentioned in the morning session, there are roadmaps being prepared for this strategy of energy transition, amongst which is measures in the immediate time frame. There are for the 5-year, for the 10-year, and so on and so forth. I would like to maybe also mention one other point to your earlier, which is different to the question, but I personally see that there's some positiveness in this being optimistic. If I take the example of the Kuwait parliament and the whole system of being democratic, this might be seen as a challenge, but also as we see that there's a change now. And we might have discussed this over coffee earlier, the fact that for so long, ever since the creation of the parliament, there was never an oil sector committee inside the parliament looking after the oil sector. But just recently, in the last, after the last elections, there is now one oil sector committee, which is asking the oil sector in Kuwait, how can we help? By putting out legislations towards making oil and gas better, as well as towards energy transition. So as an indication of positiveness and being optimistic, I see that needing to be brought up to the table here. And it gives us hope into the future. And just like everything else, I see that we shouldn't be here linear in our forecasts. There will be inflection points whereby it is going to be suddenly changing. Technology is like that in many ways. And I think human behavior is also like that. We just need to find the right incentive for everybody.
All right. So, Christian, I might just like to ask you to give a few closing thoughts. If you can maybe talk a bit about, you study the region so intensely, and all the countries in the region. I wonder if you might talk about the transition, your thoughts about it as a source of, how it's perceived politically within the six governments, and whether it's seen as a source of instability, or whether you view it as a source of potential instability for the region, and how it might affect its strategic relationship with the United States, for example, or as an opportunity as well. So sort of sticking with that theme.
Well, I do think that attitudes among policymakers have evolved over the past decade, and I think they're more ready to think about the political, economic trade-offs, differences in incentives than we perhaps would have thought possible even 10 years ago. And we have seen a spate of increases in fuel prices, reductions in subsidies, which you've written about. Especially when the oil price collapsed after 2014, we saw governments reacting to budget deficits and fiscal pressures by taking measures which, to some extent, went against the predictions of many academics who had felt that these withdrawals of subsidies, raising market prices, would stimulate unrest, and they didn't.
Right.
And so that has, to some extent, given confidence that they can go further, and they will. There's also, you may remember, there were a couple of studies of Saudi Arabia in 2012, which projected that if nothing changed, if Saudi energy consumption domestically continued to increase at the rate it was going up, without anything changing, Saudi Arabia would be using so much oil domestically that by the 2030s it would cease to be a major exporter. And of course, Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, including Kuwait, don't make money by producing oil. They make money by exporting it at international prices. So again, we've seen in Saudi Arabia, we've seen demand side measures bring down, or at least lead to a plateauing of demand increases, of consumption increases. We've seen policy choices being made. We obviously now have in Saudi Arabia a very young reformer, economically reforming crown prince who seems to grasp the need to move beyond, although Mohammed bin Salman did famously say in 2016 that I think we can live without oil by 2020, which of course he's now in the ironic position of actually needing high oil prices and revenues to push through his mega projects, his giga projects. He needs revenues to be at a certain level which explains why the Saudis also were more willing to cut oil output so drastically in the OPEC Plus meeting last year. So he's kind of boxed himself in of needing those revenues to push through the diversification. So that seems to be monetizing the assets they have to avoid stranded assets longer term. But also, as others have said, being cognizant of the fact that there will still be a residual demand for oil, and oil from the Gulf is probably cheaper and less carbon intensive to get out of the ground than anywhere else. And so even if we're ever in a situation where there's only 10 million barrels of world demand, and we won't be, that will still come from the Gulf. So that's where they see things.
I think it's interesting also we're seeing, climate action, climate policy being used in the Gulf in kind of clever ways as almost like political cover for reforms that I think governments wanted to push through anyway. But this is an additional rationale to maybe allow these, really centralized leaderships to get things done that might have been unpopular. They can maybe shed the blame, a bit of the blame for this, because they can point to outside pressure on climate to say, well, look, we need to reform subsidies on whatever it is, gasoline prices or diesel prices or water or electricity, et cetera. So it's seeing a bit of that too, and probably we'll see more. I think the Saudis are talking about rationalizing prices. We'll see if they can do that by 2030. Any final thoughts from Dr. Badr, Osama, Göçke? We're good? All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thanks so much for coming. It was great having you.